"Where's the water level?" the fire captain shouted at me, his voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. Behind him, the sky wore an angry purple bruise, flickering with orange light like the mouth of hell opening wide. All I knew was that the HOA had built a drainage pipe on my land without permission. I thought it was just typical overreach. But what I did not know then was far worse. That pipe was not just trespassing on my property. It was silently destroying the one thing that could save hundreds of lives when wildfire struck. Now, staring at my depleted lake while flames licked at the pine trees, I understood the truth. The woman behind that pipe was not just violating my land. She was draining the very thing that could save an entire community. And she had plans much bigger than a simple drainage pipe. Let me tell you how it all began. And if this satisfies you, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Mitchell Lake never had a pipe. Not once in the 3 generations has my family owned this land. My grandfather bought these 47 acres back in 1952 for $3,200, every penny scraped together from a lifetime of savings. The lake sat in the center of the property like a beating heart, 12 acres of spring-fed water that never ran dry, not even during the worst California droughts. My father raised me on its shores, taught me to fish in its depths, and when he passed 3 years ago, he left me more than just land. He left me a legacy. So when I walked out to the Eastern Ridge at 5:47 a.m. on September 15th, coffee in hand, expecting nothing but the usual quiet of dawn breaking over still water, I was not prepared for what I saw. A metal pipe, 24 inches in diameter, jutted from the bank of my lake like a steel tumor. The weld still gleamed bright under the morning sun, untouched by weather or time. I had been in Sacramento for the past 48 hours handling permits for the new barn, and my property sat 3 miles from the nearest paved road. Nobody drove out here unless they had business with me. Nobody except someone who waited for me to leave. I set down my coffee and walked closer, my boots crunching on fresh gravel that formed a makeshift access path cutting straight across my alfalfa field. The pipe extended from the water line up the bank and disappeared into a trench heading toward the property line with Ridgewood Estates, the gated community that had sprung up 5 years ago on land that used to be the old Harrison Ranch. My heart pounded as I knelt beside the cold metal, running my fingers over the engraved letters, Ridgewood HOA, Authorized Installation, Phase 1. I pulled out my phone and took photographs from every angle, capturing the fresh earth, the tire tracks from heavy machinery, and most importantly, those words claiming authorization. An authorization that could not legally exist. My property predated their entire development by 70 years. I had never signed any agreement with their association. And under California Civil Code Section 4765, an HOA has zero jurisdiction over non-member properties, whatever this was. It was trespass dressed up in official language. Back at the house, I found an envelope in my mailbox that I had missed yesterday in my rush to unload equipment. The return address read Ridgewood Estates Homeowners Association, and inside was a single sheet of paper that made my blood run cold. Notice of violation, it declared. Property owner is hereby fined $500 per day for non-compliance with Phase 1 drainage initiative, effective immediately. Failure to cooperate will result in lien placement on property. I read it 3 times, each time growing more furious. I searched online for any public notice about this so-called initiative, any community announcement, any record at all. Nothing. It was as if this entire scheme had materialized from thin air, designed specifically to target my lake. The fine would add up to $15,000 in a month, enough to trigger serious problems with my mortgage payments if they managed to place that lien. And I knew from my years as a USDA hydrological engineer that threatening a lien on property you have no legal claim over constitutes fraud under California Penal Code Section 532. Someone was playing a dangerous game. I tried calling the HOA office, but the line rang endlessly before clicking to a generic voicemail that was conveniently full. My email bounced back immediately, the mailbox supposedly unavailable. I sent a message through their community portal and watched the notification confirm it had been seen within minutes, yet no response came. They were building a paper trail of my supposed non-compliance while stonewalling every attempt at communication as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at that violation notice. I remembered something from 2 weeks ago. A Cal fire truck had been parked near my lake access road for almost an hour. I had waved at the firefighters, assuming they were doing routine inspections, and thought nothing more of it. Now that memory took on new weight. I walked to my father's old study, still untouched since his passing, and opened the filing cabinet where he kept every important document. Near the back, in a folder labeled Property Original, I found a survey map from 1987. Someone had circled a spot near the lake's eastern shore in red pen and written 3 letters EWS. I had no idea what it meant. A knock at my screen door interrupted my search. Fred Dawson, my 78-year-old neighbor whose property bordered mine to the south, stood on my porch with concern written across his weathered face. "Saw the trucks come through 2 nights ago," he said without preamble. "Figured you were having work done, but then I noticed your truck was gone. Thought I should check." I showed him the pipe, the notice, and the bounced emails. Fred listened quietly, then shook his head. "Be careful with that Whitmore woman," he said, his voice dropping low. "She has been HOA president for 7 years, and she has plans bigger than anyone realizes. Back in 2003, we had a fire that almost took everything. Your daddy's lake saved half the homes in this valley." He paused at the door, looking back with something between warning and pity. People who cross Diane Whitmore tend to regret it. After Fred left, I grabbed my keys and drove 12 minutes to the HOA administrative building. A fresh banner hung across the entrance. "Community Water Security Meeting, mandatory attendance, Friday, 7 p.m. Mandatory for whom?" I wondered. And what exactly was Diane Whitmore planning to secure? The HOA office occupied the ground floor of a stucco building painted in that particular shade of beige that developers use when they want everything to look expensive but identical. I pushed through the glass doors at 9:15 a.m., still carrying copies of the photographs I had taken at the lake, ready to demand answers from whoever sat behind the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag reading Melissa, looked up from her computer with the expression of someone who had already dealt with too many angry homeowners that morning. I told her I needed to speak with the HOA president immediately regarding unauthorized construction on my property. She typed something into her system, frowned slightly, then picked up her phone. "Mrs. Whitmore, there is a gentleman here about the drainage project. He says it is on his property." A pause. "Yes, ma'am. I will let him know." She hung up and smiled that practiced customer service smile. "Mrs. Whitmore will see you in the conference room, 3rd door on the left." Diane Whitmore was already seated when I entered, positioned at the head of a long mahogany table like a chess master waiting for her opponent to make the first wrong move. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, dressed in a cream-colored blazer over a silk blouse, her silver hair styled in a precise bob that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. What caught my attention was the gold bracelet on her left wrist, thin and elegant, with small letters engraved along its surface that I could not quite read from where I stood. She did not rise to greet me, did not offer her hand, just watched with the patient stillness of someone who had sat through 100 confrontations and won every single one. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, gesturing to a chair far down the table from her, "I understand you have concerns about our community water security initiative. Please, sit." I remained standing. "There is nothing to discuss, Mrs. Whitmore. You built a pipe on land you have no legal claim to, and I expect it to be removed within 72 hours. My property predates your development by 70 years and is not subject to your CC&Rs. This is not a negotiation." Something shifted in her posture, a slight stiffening of her shoulders that betrayed the first crack in her composure. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your passion for property rights. Truly, I do. But perhaps you do not fully understand how interconnected our community's water systems are. Your lake affects the drainage patterns for the entire Ridgewood development. Article 7.3 of our governing documents clearly establishes the association's right to address water management issues that impact our residents." She tilted her head, her expression shifting to something resembling practiced concern. "The water that flows from your lake does not recognize property lines. We have a responsibility to our homeowners. I suggest you review the documentation and attend Friday's meeting like everyone else. We can discuss this properly in a public forum. She was dismissing me. I could see it in the way she gathered the papers in front of her, in the slight turn of her body toward the door. But I had not driven 20 minutes to be brushed off by a woman who thought titles made her untouchable. I asked to see the meeting minutes where the board had voted to approve this drainage project. Diane's composure flickered, just for a heartbeat, before she recovered. "Melissa can provide you with copies of all public documents," she said, rising from her chair. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have other appointments." I found Melissa at her desk and repeated my request. She hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Diane had disappeared, then opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. "Here are the minutes from the August meeting," she said, handing me a stapled document. But as she did, another page slipped free and fluttered to the floor. I snatched it up before she could react. The original, unedited version of the meeting minutes, under the agenda item labeled Phase 1 Drainage Initiative, Mitchell Lake Access. The voting record showed only one name, Diane Whitmore. Voting, yes. The other 4 board positions were marked absent, no quorum, no proper procedure. Just one woman approving a project that required my land without any authority to do so. The version Melissa had handed me showed all 5 board members voting unanimously in favor. Someone had falsified official records, and I was holding the proof. Melissa's face went pale when she realized what I was looking at. "Mr. Mitchell, I need that back," she stammered. Reaching for the paper, I pulled it away, folding it carefully into my jacket pocket. "This is a public document from a public meeting," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I am entitled to a copy." She did not argue further, just watched me leave with something like fear in her eyes. Fear of me, or fear of what would happen when Diane found out. I could not tell. I drove home with the original document tucked safely in my glove box, my mind racing through the implications. When I pulled into my driveway, another envelope was waiting in my mailbox. A second violation notice, dated today, adds another $500 to my growing tab. The total now stood at $1,000 and climbing. I called Marcus Webb, a 61-year-old attorney who had helped my father with land disputes years ago. His voice was calm but serious. "Garrett, they have no legal standing to fine you, but that does not mean they will not try to place a lien anyway and force you to fight it in court. Get me copies of everything." That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun set over the lake, the metal pipe visible as a dark scar against the water's edge. Fred wandered over from his property, 2 beers in hand, and settled into the chair beside me. I told him about the falsified minutes, about Diane's dismissive attitude, about the mounting fines. Fred nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "That lake saved homes during the '03 fire. Garrett, Cal Fire knows its value even if nobody else remembers. Diane Whitmore remembers everything, though she just uses information differently than the rest of us." He took a long drink, staring at the water. "She was a real estate broker before this, lost her license back in 2018. Something about misrepresentation, but nobody talks about it anymore." He pointed his bottle toward the bracelet I had seen on her wrist. "You notice that gold thing she wears? Has letters on it. Ask around about Clearwater Development sometime." At 9:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with an automated alert from First Valley Credit Union. Their system had flagged a claim filed against my property earlier that day, triggering an after-hours notification. The subject line made my stomach drop. "Important notification of potential property lien. Amount claimed $15,000. The letter from First Valley Credit Union arrived by certified mail 3 days later, and it confirmed everything I had feared. The HOA had officially filed a $15,000 lien against my property, and the bank's language was polite but devastating. As the holder of my mortgage, they were required to notify me of any encumbrances. If the lien remained unresolved within 60 days, they could invoke the acceleration clause and demand immediate full payment of my remaining $340,000 balance. Fail that, and foreclosure proceedings would begin. My family's land, worth over $1.2 million, 3 generations of Mitchell history, could be ripped away because of a pipe I never authorized. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at that letter, feeling the walls of my grandfather's house closing in around me. The math was simple and brutal. Fight in court for $20,000 to $30,000 in legal fees, or lose everything to fines that should never have existed in the first place. I called Marcus Webb that afternoon, and his assessment was grimly realistic. The HOA is betting you will either pay up to make this go away or run out of money before a judge ever sees the case, he said. You need to prove the lien is fraudulent, not just improper. Start with the county records. Find out if any easements on your land might explain why they think they have a right to be there. It was not much, but it was a direction. The next morning, I drove 45 minutes to the county recorder's office in the main administrative building downtown. The clerk, a patient woman in her 60s named Dorothy, listened to my explanation and disappeared into the archives. She returned 20 minutes later with a folder that would change everything. There is one easement on record for your property, Dorothy said, sliding the document across the counter. Recorded in 1987, between Garrett Mitchell and the county of Riverside. My father's signature, almost 40 years ago. He had known something about this lake that he never told me. I opened the folder and began scanning the legal language, my heart pounding harder with each line. The easement granted CAL FIRE emergency access to Mitchell Lake for fire suppression purposes only. But the critical clause was buried in paragraph 4, any modification, including physical alterations or third-party access. Required written consent of both parties and explicit approval from the County Board of Supervisors. The HOA was not mentioned anywhere in the document. This was not just a technicality. This was proof that Diane Whitmore had built her pipe in direct violation of an existing legal agreement, an agreement that protected my property and designated my lake as a county emergency resource. The EWS notation on my father's old map suddenly made perfect sense. Emergency water source. He had signed this easement to help protect the community, and now someone was exploiting that protection for purposes he never could have imagined. I photographed every page, making sure to capture the signatures, the seal, and especially paragraph 4. I asked Dorothy if there were any other filings related to my property in the past year. She checked her system and shook her head. Nothing recorded. If someone filed for a new easement or modification, it would show up here. The HOA had never even attempted to go through proper channels. They had simply built their pipe and dared me to stop them. As I walked back to my truck, I passed by the HOA administrative building. The afternoon sun slanted through a corner office window where someone had left the blinds half open, and the light caught a row of filing cabinets against the far wall. One cabinet bore a label I could just barely make out through the glass: Easement Agreements, Confidential. Diane Whitmore had been a real estate broker for over 2 decades. She would know exactly how easements worked, exactly what documents existed, exactly how to exploit them. There was no way she was unaware of the 1987 agreement. She was counting on me never finding it. Back home, I drafted a formal cease and desist letter with Marcus's help, citing California Civil Code Section 4765, and demanding that the HOA provide their legal basis within 10 business days. I also filed a complaint with the State Contractor License Board, requesting verification that proper permits had been obtained for the pipe installation. The waiting was the hardest part. I found myself standing at the edge of the lake each evening, watching the water line recede. The rocks along the eastern shore that used to sit 3 feet below the surface now stood exposed, streaked with algae dying in the open air. A band of pale mud encircled the entire lake like a scar, marking where the water had been just 2 weeks ago. Something vital was bleeding out of this land, drop by drop, through a pipe that should never have existed, and I still did not know where the water was going or why someone wanted it badly enough to risk fraud charges. The response from the State Contractor License Board arrived by email on day 8. I opened it, expecting bureaucratic delays or requests for additional information. What I found instead made my hands shake. Our records indicate that no permit application has been submitted or approved for any project described as Ridgewood HOA Drainage Project at the address you provided. Construction of drainage infrastructure without proper permitting is a violation of California Business and Professions Code Section 7028. We have opened an investigation file and may contact you for additional information. No permits. No legal authority. They had built the pipe illegally and then filed a lien based on fines for a project they had no right to construct. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Somewhere in that HOA office, in a cabinet marked confidential. were documents that Diane Whitmore did not want anyone to find. I forwarded the email to Marcus Webb with a single line, "How do we get access to those files?" His response came within the hour, "Subpoena, but first, we need to file suit. Are you ready to go to war?" Marcus Webb called me the following Monday with news that reframed everything I thought I knew about this fight. "I did some digging on Diane Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the careful weight of a man who had uncovered something significant. She was a licensed real estate broker in California for 23 years, mostly commercial properties and land development. But in 2018, the Department of Real Estate suspended her license for misrepresentation in a transaction involving water rights. I felt something click into place, a piece of a puzzle I had not even realized I was assembling. "There is more," Marcus continued. "She is currently listed as a 23% shareholder in a company called Clearwater Development, LLC. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. The gold bracelet on Diane's wrist. The letters I could not quite read during our meeting. Clearwater. She had been wearing her own company's name while telling me the pipe was for community safety. I asked Marcus what Clearwater was planning, and his answer made my blood run cold. They have been negotiating to purchase 200 acres of forest land adjacent to Ridgewood Estates. The deal has stalled for 2 years because the county will not approve development without a guaranteed water source." He paused, letting the implications settle. "Your lake is the only viable option within 5 miles. If Clearwater could demonstrate control over Mitchell Lake, or if the property changed hands to someone willing to grant access, their entire plan becomes feasible." The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Drain my lake through the HOA pipe, bury me under fraudulent fines, trigger foreclosure through the bank, then buy my land at auction for a fraction of its value. Diane was not protecting the community. She was engineering a hostile takeover of my water rights. And every day that pipe stayed in the ground was another day closer to her victory. The HOA was nothing but a corporate shell dressed in neighborhood clothing. I asked Marcus what we could do with this information, and his response was frustratingly cautious. "Conflict of interest in an HOA is a civil matter. What we need is direct evidence that she used her position to benefit Clearwater. Financial records, communications, anything connecting the two roles." I knew exactly where that evidence might be. The filing cabinet marked confidential is in the HOA office. Under the Davis-Sterling Act, HOA members can inspect association records, but I was not a member. "Request them anyway," Marcus advised. "Make them formally refuse. Their refusal becomes ammunition when we file suit." The next day, I sent a certified letter requesting all financial records and contracts related to the Phase 1 drainage initiative. 4 days later, Diane's response arrived on HOA letterhead. "Your request is denied pursuant to privacy protections. As a non-member, you have no standing to access internal documentation. Further harassment will result in additional legal action." She called my inquiry harassment while she drained my lake and threatened my home. But her refusal would look damning in front of a judge. I returned to the county archives with a more specific request, asking for any correspondence related to the easement since its original filing. The archivist found one additional item misfiled under the wrong parcel number, a letter from 1988, written by County Fire Marshal Harold Peterson to my father, thanking him for granting emergency water access. The final paragraph stated the critical point that changed everything. The easement was exclusive to CAL FIRE and could not be transferred, assigned, or utilized by any third party without formal county approval and property owner consent. This was not just trespassing. This was an interference with public safety infrastructure. The HOA pipe was actively draining a designated county emergency resource without authorization from anyone with the legal power to grant it. I drafted an email to the CAL FIRE Prevention Bureau that evening, attaching scans of the easement, the fire marshal's letter, and photographs of the unauthorized pipe. In the subject line, I included the phrase "emergency water reserve compromise," hoping it might flag their attention faster than a routine inquiry. The community had already made up its mind about me. Someone had posted a photo of my property with the caption, "This man cares more about his pond than your children's safety," and the comments underneath had multiplied into a wall of hostility from people I had never met. I stopped going into town for groceries, started driving an extra 20 minutes to the next county just to avoid the judgment in strangers' eyes. Whatever narrative Diane was spinning, it had taken root faster than I could respond. That evening, I sat on my porch in the fading light, watching the lake continue its slow death. The old fishing dock my father built when I was 12 now stood entirely on dry land, its posts marking where the water line used to be like a grave marker for everything this place once was, somewhere beyond those pines. Diane Whitmore was calculating how long it would take for me to break. She had money, connections, and 7 years of HOA authority. I had a stack of documents and a family legacy I refused to surrender. At 9:14 p.m., my phone rang with a 760 area code I did not recognize. I answered, expecting another sales call or a reporter, but the voice on the other end carried unmistakable authority. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Captain Daniel Reeves from the Cal Fire Prevention Bureau. Your email came through flagged as priority because of the emergency reserve language in your subject line. Our system automatically escalates anything that might affect wildfire response infrastructure." He paused, and I heard papers shuffling in the background. "I have been reviewing the documents you attached, and I need to understand something. You are telling me that someone built an unauthorized drainage system on a designated Cal Fire water source, and that water is actively being diverted as we speak." I confirmed everything, my heart pounding. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds that felt like an hour. "Mr. Mitchell, I am going to need you to meet me at your property first thing tomorrow morning. Do not touch that pipe. Do not let anyone else touch it either. What you have stumbled onto is bigger than a neighbor dispute. This is a potential felony." Captain Daniel Reeves arrived at my property at 7:30 a.m. the next morning, driving a Cal Fire truck that looked like it had seen more wildfires than most people see in a lifetime. He was a solidly built man in his early 50s, with the weathered face of someone who spent decades staring into flames and the calm demeanor of someone who had learned not to panic under any circumstances. We shook hands by the edge of the lake, and I watched his expression shift as he took in the exposed shoreline and the metal pipe jutting from the bank. "This is not our design," he said flatly, kneeling to examine the installation. "Cal Fire infrastructure pumps water up for aircraft. This pipe does the opposite. Someone built a drain disguised as emergency equipment." He stood and brushed dirt from his knees, his jaw tight. "The HOA requested permission to modify this site last March. We denied it because draining the lake would compromise wildfire response for the entire region. Diane Whitmore signed that request personally." Reeves pulled a folder from his truck and handed me the document that would change everything. Not the denial letter, which I had expected, but an email printout attached to the file. My hands went cold the moment I saw the sender line. It was a message from Diane Whitmore to the contractor, dated 2 weeks after Cal Fire rejected her request. The words were brief and devastating. "Proceed with Phase 1 installation as planned. Cal Fire response is irrelevant to our timeline. Payment will be processed through Clearwater Development, LLC. Shemazu." She had received an official denial from a state agency responsible for wildfire safety, and her response was to ignore it completely. I read the email 3 times, feeling my pulse pound in my temples. This was not a misunderstanding or bureaucratic oversight. This was deliberate, documented defiance of emergency protocols, routed through her own company to hide the money trail. I asked Reeves where the water was going, and he pulled up a satellite map on his tablet. "We traced the drainage line yesterday," he said, zooming in on an area a quarter-mile east of Ridgewood Estates. The image shifted, and suddenly I was looking at a newly constructed retention pond sitting on undeveloped land. The scale indicator showed it was nearly 2 acres, large enough to hold hundreds of thousands of gallons. "This property is under option by Clearwater Development," Reeves continued. "They have been stockpiling water for months, probably to demonstrate adequate resources for their proposed 200-acre project." He looked up at me, and I saw disgust in his eyes for the first time. "They are siphoning a designated fire suppression source to fund a real estate deal. If we had a major wildfire tomorrow and needed your lake at capacity, we would come up 40% short. That gap could mean losing dozens of homes." The satellite image burned itself into my memory, stolen water, sitting in a corporate pond, while my family's lake slowly died over the next 48 hours. I worked with Reeves and Marcus Webb to compile everything into an undeniable case file. The centerpiece was Diane's email and the corresponding invoice showing Clearwater had paid the contractor directly. Dr. Patricia Lawson, a hydrological engineer Marcus connected me with. ran projections based on the pipe's flow rate and current water levels. Her conclusion hit like a sledgehammer at the current drainage rate. The lake would drop below the 4-foot threshold required for aerial tanker operations within 6 weeks. Below that line, the water becomes too shallow for safe scooping, effectively removing Mitchell Lake from the county's wildfire defense entirely. I assembled everything into a 47-slide presentation, each page building toward an inescapable conclusion. This was not neighbor drama. This was a sabotage of public safety infrastructure for private profit. The community response shifted faster than I expected once the evidence started circulating. Fred told me that a woman at the hardware store, someone who had publicly called me selfish just a week earlier, stopped him to ask if it was true that the HOA had been stealing water for a land deal. The next day, a retired firefighter named Bill Horton knocked on my door holding a printout of CAL FIRE's denial letter that someone had leaked to a local news site. "I fought the '03 fire," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your daddy's lake saved my house. If what they are saying about Whitmore is true, she needs to answer for it in front of the whole community." 127 residents signed a petition demanding a special meeting, enough to force the board into action under their own bylaws. Diane tried to delay with procedural objections, but the pressure was mounting too fast for bureaucratic excuses. On day 8, the HOA announced that a mandatory community meeting would be held the following Sunday at 7 p.m. in the Ridgewood Community Center. I received no formal invitation, which was probably intentional, but I did not need one. Marcus helped me prepare my presentation, coaching me on how to present technical evidence to a room full of angry homeowners. "Do not accuse," he advised. "Just show them the documents and let them reach their own conclusions. The evidence speaks for itself." I practiced the presentation 6 times, timing each section, anticipating questions, and preparing for Diane to interrupt or deflect. Fred stopped by the night before with a 6-pack and a warning. "She is going to try to make this about you," he said. "About your attitude, your property, your refusal to cooperate. Do not take the bait. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and let her hang herself." I nodded, staring out at the lake in the fading light. The water line had dropped another 3 inches since Reeves's visit. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the dry rustle of wind through the pines, the sound of a forest waiting for a spark. The war was about to go public, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I believed I might actually win. The Buckhorn fire started at 2:17 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, 48 hours before the scheduled HOA meeting. A downed power line sparked against dry brush somewhere in the hills east of Ridgewood, and within minutes the flames had found their appetite. Santa Ana winds blowing at 45 miles per hour transformed what might have been a containable brush fire into a monster racing toward the valley. I first saw the smoke from my kitchen window, a column of gray rising against the blue sky. Within an hour, that column had become a wall, and by evening, the horizon looked like molten copper had been poured across the mountains, liquid and alive and hungry. CAL FIRE dispatched 12 aircraft and 300 ground personnel. The news reported that the fire would reach Ridgewood within 6 to 8 hours if the winds held. Ash began falling on my property like snow from a crematorium. Captain Reeves called me at 4:53 p.m., and the tension in his voice told me everything before he spoke a word. "We have a problem," he said. "Our tankers tried to scoop from Mitchell Lake an hour ago. The water level is at 4.2 feet. We need a minimum of 6 feet for safe aerial operations." I felt my stomach drop. 3 weeks of drainage had crippled the lake's capacity at the worst possible moment. The water that should have been protecting Ridgewood was sitting uselessly in a corporate retention pond while the forest burned. "The irony is not lost on me," Reeves continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. "The woman who built that pipe might have just doomed the very community she claims to be protecting. We need to shut that drain immediately. Can you meet me at the lake in 20 minutes? I drove faster than I should have on roads clogged with evacuation traffic. Families were loading cars with photographs and pets, their faces tight with fear as ash coated their windshields. When I reached the lake, Reeves was already there with a crew of 4 firefighters and a county engineer. The pipe jutted from the bank, still draining water even as flames devoured the hillsides to the east. "We need to close this valve and reverse the flow," Reeves said, pointing to a junction box partially buried near the shore. Your background is hydrological engineering. I could use your eyes on this. I knelt beside the junction and examined the mechanism. The valve was a standard industrial gate design, but my hands froze when I saw what they had done to it. Someone had welded a steel plate directly over the manual control, fusing it permanently in the open position. This was not negligence. This was sabotage designed to ensure no one could ever shut it off. The county engineer cut through the lock plate with an angle grinder while I traced the pipe's path and calculated flow rates. Closing the valve would stop the bleeding, but restoring the lake to operational depth would take time we did not have. There is a spring-fed inlet on the north shore, I told Reeves, remembering something my father had shown me decades ago. It has been silted up for years, but if we can clear the obstruction, we might gain a few critical inches. Reeves dispatched 2 men with shovels while the rest of us worked on the valve. At 6:22 p.m., the gate finally closed. The flow stopped, for the first time in 3 weeks. Mitchell Lake was no longer bleeding out through Diane Whitmore's pipe. At the north shore, the firefighters reported that clearing the silt had opened a channel nearly 8 inches wide, and water was now flowing in at roughly 15 gallons per minute. Not a flood, but enough to matter if we had time. The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. I watched the water level creep upward while the fire consumed everything in its path to the east. The cleared spring inlet kept flowing, its rate increasing to nearly 25 gallons per minute as more sediment washed free and the channel widened naturally. By 10 p.m., the lake had risen to 4.8 feet. Not ideal, but enough for emergency scooping if the pilots were careful. Reeves authorized limited tanker runs, and I stood on the shore watching aircraft descend toward my family's water, filling their bellies with the resource that Diane had tried to steal. The fire reached the ridge overlooking Ridgewood at 11:40 p.m., close enough that I could feel its heat from half a mile away. Then the tankers made their final runs, dropping thousands of gallons along the perimeter, and the flames that had seemed unstoppable finally began to slow. By 3 a.m., the fire line had stabilized 800 meters from the nearest homes. No structures lost, no lives taken. I sat on my porch as dawn broke, exhausted beyond words, watching smoke rise from the blackened hillsides. The terror of the night had stripped away pretense. People who had called me selfish were now realizing how close they had come to losing everything because of a drainage pipe they had never questioned. My phone buzzed with a message from Bill Horton, the retired firefighter who had knocked on my door days earlier. His text was brief. My wife cried all night thinking we would lose the house. Then I told her about the pipe, about Whitmore, about what she did to your lake. She wants blood. Garrett. Everyone does. Attached was a forwarded email announcing an emergency HOA meeting at 10 a.m. and a video clip someone had recorded during the fire response, showing CAL FIRE personnel cutting through the welded lock plate on my property. The clip had already been shared hundreds of times. By 7 a.m., my phone was ringing non-stop with calls from neighbors I had never met. The woman who had tried to destroy my family's legacy was about to face a community that had spent the night watching their homes nearly burn because of her greed. The Ridgewood Community Center had never held 247 people before, but it held them now. Every seat was taken, and the overflow crowd lined the walls 3 deep, their faces still carrying traces of ash and exhaustion from the night before. The smell of smoke clung to their clothes, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. I arrived at 9:45 a.m. with my laptop and a flash drive containing the presentation I had built over the past week. Captain Reeves met me at the door, wearing his formal CAL FIRE uniform instead of the field gear I had grown accustomed to seeing him in. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, though ready was not quite the word. I had spent 3 weeks being called selfish, obstructionist, and a man who valued his pond over public safety. Now I was about to show this community exactly who had really endangered them. Diane Whitmore sat at the front table with the 4 other board members, though 3 of them refused to make eye contact with her. She wore a navy blue blazer and her signature gold bracelet, the one with Clearwater engraved on its surface, and her posture projected absolute confidence. When I walked to the podium, she smiled at me with the patient condescension of someone who still believed she controlled the room. The HOA vice president called the meeting to order and announced that I had been granted 15 minutes to present my concerns. I connected my laptop to the projector and let the evidence speak. the falsified meeting minutes with only Diane's vote, Cal Fire's denial letter from March, then the email that changed everything. Proceed with Phase 1 installation as planned. Cal Fire response is irrelevant to our timeline. Geez, when I displayed the invoice showing Clearwater Development had paid the contractor directly, a woman in the fourth row gasped audibly and turned to stare at Diane with undisguised horror. The final slides documented the fire response. I showed one photograph of the welded lock plate, the sabotage that had been designed to ensure no one could ever shut off the drain, and the room understood immediately what it meant. Someone had planned for this pipe to be permanent, unstoppable, irreversible. Captain Reeves took the podium after me, and his testimony was brief but devastating. If we had not been able to close that valve and restore partial water capacity last night, he said, his voice steady and cold, I estimate that we would have lost between 40 and 60 homes. The pipe that drained Mitchell Lake was built illegally, paid for by a private development company, and designed to steal a public emergency resource. This was not community safety. This was corporate theft. He stepped back from the microphone, and the silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Diane stood before anyone could call on her, crossing to the microphone with the determined stride of someone who still believed she could talk her way out of anything. I understand emotions are running high, she began, her voice smooth and measured, but I want to assure everyone that my only priority has always been the safety and prosperity of this community. The drainage project was designed to prevent flooding, and the connection to Clearwater is simply efficient resource management. A man in the third row shot to his feet, his finger pointing directly at her face. My daughter had an asthma attack from the smoke last night, he said, his voice shaking with rage. She is 7 years old. She could not breathe because you drained the lake that was supposed to protect us. Others joined in, voices rising, and I watched Diane's composure begin to fracture. Her smile tightened. Her hand moved to adjust her bracelet, fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. You do not understand how development works, she said, her voice climbing higher than she intended. These projects require water access, and the county was never going to approve an alternative source in time. I did what needed to be done. The room erupted. People were on their feet now, shouting accusations, demanding answers. Diane's jaw clenched, and I saw something shift behind her eyes, the recognition that control was slipping away faster than she could recover it. Her hand gripped the podium edge, knuckles whitening. None of this was supposed to happen, she shouted, her voice cracking on the final word. If that fire had not started, no one would have ever known everything was planned perfectly. The room went dead silent. 247 people stared at her, processing what she had just confessed. The microphone was still live, and in the back of the room, I noticed a county sheriff's deputy who had been standing near the exit step forward with sudden interest. The vice president called for a vote of no confidence, and hands rose across the room like a wave. 231 residents voted to remove Diane Whitmore from the HOA board when the count was announced. A sound moved through the crowd that was not quite applause, something deeper and more primal, the exhale of a community that had finally seen the truth. The remaining board members resigned on the spot, and the deputy approached Diane as she stood frozen at the podium. He informed her that the district attorney had opened a formal investigation and requested that she remain available for questioning. As they escorted her toward the exit, she passed within 3 feet of where I stood. She stopped. Her eyes met mine, and I saw her hand drift unconsciously to her Clearwater bracelet, the symbol of everything she had built and everything she had just lost. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. There was nothing left to say. I held her gaze without blinking, without speaking, until she finally turned and walked through the doors into a morning still hazy with smoke from the fire she had nearly made unstoppable. 6 months passed before the legal system delivered its final verdict, but when it came with the weight of undeniable justice. Diane Whitmore stood before Judge Patricia Harmon in Riverside County Superior Court on a Tuesday morning in March, wearing the same navy blazer she had worn to the community meeting, though this time without the Clearwater bracelet that had once symbolized her ambitions. The charges read like a catalog of her crimes: fraud under California Penal Code Section 532, trespass under Section 02, and endangering public safety. The judge's voice was measured but firm as she announced the sentence. 2 years probation, $7,500 in fines for trespass, $40,000 for endangering public safety. Total financial penalties $47,500, plus $28,000 in restitution paid directly to me for legal fees and emotional distress. And one final provision that seemed to hit Diane harder than any fine, a 10-year ban from holding any HOA board position in the state of California. Clearwater Development fared no better. The state attorney general's office completed its investigation in April, concluding that the company had violated California water rights statutes by diverting a designated emergency resource for private commercial use. The penalty was $350,000 in fines, and the 200-acre development project that had driven this entire scheme was suspended indefinitely. The company's CEO resigned within a week, and 3 board members faced ongoing investigations for securities fraud related to misrepresentations made to investors about the project's viability. The empire Diane had tried to build on stolen water collapsed before a single foundation was ever poured. Fred brought me the news clipping about the Clearwater settlement, and we sat on my porch drinking beer while the spring sun warmed the valley. "Some people think they are smarter than everyone else," he said quietly. "Usually, they are just willing to do things others would not." The Ridgewood HOA held its first election under new bylaws in April, and the community chose a board that included Fred as senior advisor despite his protests that he was too old for politics. They asked me to serve as an unpaid water advisory consultant, a position that essentially meant I would attend quarterly meetings and remind them never to touch Mitchell Lake again. I accepted, not because I wanted to be involved in HOA business, but because my father would have wanted the partnership he had envisioned in 1987 to finally work the way it was supposed to. First Valley Credit Union sent a formal letter of apology and confirmed that the fraudulent lien had been permanently removed from my property records. The mortgage continued on its original terms, and the threat of foreclosure evaporated like morning mist over the lake. On a Saturday afternoon in late May, 150 residents of Ridgewood Estates drove out to Mitchell Farm for a community celebration that someone had organized without my knowledge. Children splashed in the shallows of the lake while their parents set up folding tables and fired up grills along the shore. Bill Horton, the retired firefighter whose daughter had suffered an asthma attack during the fire, brought a handmade wooden sign that read, "Thank you, Mitchell Lake," and asked permission to hang it on my fence. I watched families playing in water that had once been marked for corporate theft, and I understood that my father's decision to sign that easement nearly 40 years ago had created something larger than either of us could have imagined. This lake did not just belong to the Mitchells. It belonged to everyone it had ever protected. Captain Reeves arrived at sunset, when the crowd had thinned, and the light had turned golden over the water. We walked together to the eastern shore, where the old pipe had been removed and replaced with a new Cal Fire installation, properly designed this time, with intake valves that drew water up for aerial tankers instead of draining it away. A new sign had been mounted beside the access point, its letters crisp and official, "Mitchell Lake, official Cal Fire Emergency Water Reserve, protected since 1987. Reeves studied the sign for a moment, then looked at me. "Your father would be proud," he said. I nodded, remembering the survey map with EWS circled in red pen, the legacy he had left without ever explaining it. "He knew what this lake meant," I said. "He just did not know who would try to take it." I walked to the water's edge and knelt, dipping my hand into the cool surface. The lake had returned to its full depth over the winter rains, clear and cold and alive. Mitchell Lake was still here, and it would be here long after all of us were gone. Sometimes, the people who claim to protect us are the ones we need protection from. Diane Whitmore thought she could steal a community's safety for her own profit, but she learned that evidence, persistence, and the truth always find a way to surface. If this story resonated with you, support the HOA stories by subscribing and sharing. Every like helps us bring more stories of justice to light. Stay vigilant. Stay informed.